In this video, I'm going to tell you 5 things that wildlife photographers can learn from jazz musicians. This is 5 for Friday. Hey guys, I hope you're doing well. For the month of December, I'm taking a bit of a break from wildlife photography. In the new year, on the 1st of January, I'll be right out there again. But for this month, I'm back home. I'm playing a bunch of gigs. As some of you may know, I also spent a lot of time as a jazz musician, and there are some interesting parallels between what I do in wildlife photography and what I do in jazz. And in this channel, I often talk about things like agility and the need to be able to improvise and the need to be able to react to changing situations. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk to you about is the idea of embracing the unknown. This is something that we do a lot in jazz. We go into performance situations where we really are not sure what is going to happen until it actually happens, if it does happen. And there are things that just come up and we have to learn to deal with them. And I think this is something that we can really think about a lot in wildlife photography, because it is a art form in which we don't have a lot of control over many of the variables. We are not sure whether we'll find the animals sometimes. When we do find them, we can't control their behavior, what they do. We can't control the weather, we can't control the light. There are so many unknowns. And I think it's great to have an attitude in which we embrace these unknowns. And when you think about it, we have many challenges. So, for example, I made a video recently called Getting Physical in Wildlife Photography, and I talked in that video about the importance of taking a shooting position that might put you out of your comfort zone, and that when you take a position that is the most physically easy to take, that it may limit you. So things like, for example, lying down, sometimes maybe in some mud or some muck, or standing in water in waders and shooting, also that you can get a low perspective when you're shooting. Those are things that can be challenging, and especially if you're around dangerous animals and they're coming close, there are some unknowns that you may have to deal with. Another thing is embracing low light. It's when you do that, it's sometimes hard to see. Also, time is scarce because the sun is going down fairly quickly and you have finite time with which to work with. When you are searching for animals that are difficult to find or difficult to get near, there are a lot of unknowns with that. Going to remote destinations in search of wildlife, there can be many unknowns with that. And also even shooting in what some photographers call target-rich environments, where there are a lot of animals around, but there's lots of different species and you're not sure which species you will encounter, and also there's a lot of variety with the landscapes. These are all situations where you don't know exactly what's going to happen. There are so many variables that are not under your control, but the exciting thing is that these make for potentially great opportunities as long as you can make the most of them. So if you're someone who really likes to know what is going to happen ahead of time, if you really like to plan things out, if you like to have control of all the variables, then this is something for you to perhaps work on in your wildlife photography, because the reality is that we don't have a lot of control over a lot of these things. Now let's talk about the idea of improvisation. This is something that jazz musicians do a lot. What does it mean to improvise? In the most general sense, it means that you have to solve a problem or come up with something even if you're not completely ready to do it. There are lots of situations for jazz musicians where they are performing live in front of an audience and something happens and they have to respond. Or if they don't respond, they might miss an opportunity to make the performance stronger. And no matter what the challenges are that they're faced with at the time, they have to figure out something. They don't have the luxury of stopping the performance and saying, hey, wait a minute, I need a moment to think about something. And this happens a lot in wildlife photography too. We're presented with opportunities where animals appear, and perhaps it's not the animal we were thinking we might see, or perhaps the animal is doing something that we've never seen before and we didn't expect that. and we just have to figure out how to respond. And it's important to remember that improvisation is something that can be practiced. Some people think improvisation is just making stuff up on the spot, and it is, but it's something that you can get better at, whether you're an improv comedian or a jazz musician or a wildlife photographer. By putting yourself in situations constantly where you're forced to respond and react and come up with a solution, you can get better at this. And another thing that's really interesting to think about is the idea that when you improvise, that you wouldn't necessarily always respond in the same way. So for example, if you ask a jazz musician to play a solo, to improvise a solo, they won't play the same thing every time. And likewise, if you're presented with a situation in wildlife photography where, let's just say, a fox is walking towards you, that you wouldn't necessarily take the same kind of image every single time, that you would actually try to come up with something different. I think that's a really compelling thing. Now, in order to do this, you have to have a lot of things at your disposal, including a bit of a toolkit, a bit of a vocabulary, some particular techniques that will help you to generate multiple solutions or multiple types of responses to the same situation. In both jazz and in wildlife photography, there are technical things that we have to deal with, and at the same time we're also trying to be creative and artistic. Here's the thing, you need to be able to do those technical things without even thinking too much about them. Those are things that should be on autopilot. When I'm playing the bass and I'm playing notes to create interesting bass lines or to create an interesting solo or to respond in an interesting way to something that, let's say, another musician has played, I can't be thinking of these things such as where my fingers go and how do I coordinate my left and my right hand. In the same way, in wildlife photography, the technical processes such as figuring out exposure and using the really complex camera gear that we use, those are things that I can't be spending time on in the moment. I just need to, those things need to be so practiced that they happen automatically so that I can free myself up to be creative and artistic. However, you can take it to the extreme. So for some people, it is a challenge. The technical things are a challenge, and that's something that they need to work on. But there are also people, both jazz musicians as well as wildlife photographers, who are too technical, meaning that so for example, there are musicians who are highly adept on their instruments. They're real technicians on their instruments, and they can play all over the instrument, and they can, they have a lot of technique. But it doesn't necessarily mean that their music is compelling and interesting and that it draws people in. And in the same way, there are photographers who are very technical and their images are always sharp, but the images are not necessarily interesting. And so this is an important thing to balance, is having enough technique that you can free yourself up to be creative, but not so technical that it gets in the way and that it actually overwhelms your creativity. In jazz, we often talk about musicians that have big ears. This means that they are listening all the time. They have a very high awareness, and when something happens during a performance, they immediately pick it up and they respond to it. They don't just miss those opportunities. And similarly, in wildlife photography, we need to be so aware in order to take advantage of any opportunities that arise. And it's not just about being able to react to things, but it's also being able to read situations and predict when something might happen. So, for example, when we're photographing a particular animal, of course we are looking and listening to that animal to see what will happen, but at the same time there may be other things that are going on with other animals, for example, in the environment that might give us a clue as to what the animal that we're shooting might be doing or might do. Being aware of what's happening in the environment with the light and how it's changing, and understanding the environment the animal is in and how the relationship between us and the subject and the position and the angle that we're shooting from and so forth, how all of those things come together is really important, because the animal is moving around and the background is changing as the animal moves around, and potentially when we move, even when we're just changing the angle at which we're shooting at, all of these things contribute to our composition. So understanding all of that, being aware of all of that, so that you can use those options that are available to you and solve the problems and create the compelling images. That's really important. And also even learning or being aware of how our own presence in the environment with the animal affects the images. These are all things that are so necessary. And of course, when we are photographing wildlife that is, let's say, shy, that is hard to get near, or that is dangerous to be near, we also need, those are other reasons for us to also be very aware of what's going on. So working on your awareness in so many different ways is something that can really help you a lot in your wildlife photography. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is establishing and developing your style. In jazz, we really value individualism. We really value people who are bringing something unique and interesting that others are not bringing. And the music of jazz is made up very much of individual voices who together play as a team, but they also bring something that is unique to the sound and to the ensemble. In wildlife photography, it's really important for you to understand your style so that you can develop it, and so that you're not just producing the same images as everyone else out there. This begins by going beyond just taking simple record shots. Don't just take images that just have an animal in the shot just because the animal was there and you managed to get it in the frame. You really want to be thinking about what it is that you're doing, and this begins even with the most basic understanding of the genre that you're trying to shoot. Are you, for example, trying to create images that are fine art images of wildlife, or are you trying to do more reportage work where you're documenting stories perhaps about conservation? Shoot in a way that appeals to you, and then decide if that's something that's really important to you, to fulfill your own desires for the style of imagery that you're creating, or perhaps you're trying to shoot in a particular way that appeals to other people, perhaps for commercial reasons. The point is that you really need to be able to identify what your style is, to the point that you can describe it and highlight what are the things that people will see in your images that will constitute that style. And look at your work and look at the work of others and decide what it is that you like or don't like. So think about your style. This is something I mentioned in a previous video talking about telephoto lenses. And I was talking about the need to have gear that supports your style, whatever that style is. But a lot of people don't even think about this at all. And when I ask some people, hey, what is your style of wildlife photography, they can't really answer. But yet when I look at their images, I do see a particular style. So this is something that is really worth thinking about, just getting that sense of what it is that you're trying to do, and especially if you're trying to create images that stand out. You don't want them to look like everyone else's images. You really want to do your own thing. Now, it's important to realize that you're not necessarily going to appeal to everyone. You need to figure out whether or not you want to be true to yourself and the particular style that you're going for, even if some people don't like it, because there will surely be some people who will like it. I hope you found this video informative and interesting and thought-provoking. If you got any questions or comments, please post below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.